I'm pleased to talk today about mobilizing sustainable finance in the Middle East. I'm going to share my screen so we can go through a presentation and really learn about some of the options to accelerate green finance in the Middle East. This draws quite heavily on a piece of work I recently completed with HSBC and co-authored with the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government here in Dubai, looking at a number of different countries and the ways in which they could be financed. To start off, in our analysis of green finance, we really wanted to define a really clear objectives. What were we trying to understand here? And we recognize that there's a huge amount of finance needed for the Sustainable Development Goals. Globally, it's about $5 to $7 trillion per year, and there's a gap of about $2 to $4 trillion per year. So only about half of what we need to be investing in sustainability is currently being invested. We need to almost double that. We recognize also that most of the finance would come from the private sector. In the countries we studied, the private sector comprises about 75% of the economy. So that's really where the majority of finance is going to come from. It's not all going to come from the government. But governments do have a responsibility and a means to shape the macro conditions within which private sector financial decisions occur. So it's really the government that has a strong opportunity to shape the way investment happens in countries. But governments have a lot of different levers they can pull, right? They can do a lot of different things. And we wanted to identify what specific levers each government should prioritize to maximize the returns on their efforts. So the question we really sought to answer is, how can governments best mobilize private sector finance to close the funding gap? Okay. We constrained our scope a little bit. We were looking at first across a number of different sectors to see if green finance should be approached in a sectoral way, looking at energy, industry, buildings, transport, waste and water, and agriculture. But we decided actually that focusing on a sector breakdown was first of all familiar. A lot of people had already done that, but also didn't give us the kind of cross-cutting insights that we wanted. We wanted to look really at cross-cutting financial mechanisms and how those could be applied to all sectors, across all sectors. We wanted to also define the geographies of studies. So we looked at really 8 countries. We looked at Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. We chose these because there's relatively little study actually devoted to this particular region on the topic of green finance, and it also reflects a real diversity of countries. So this group represents all levels of development and vastly different population sizes, but they also have some shared characteristics as well. They have a similar economic makeup. For example, they're quite reliant on natural resources, especially oil and gas. They have similar climate-related challenges as well. They're all water-stressed countries, and they all have to manage extreme heat. So that was the scope of our study. And we also really want to clarify our target groups and timelines. So we really wanted to focus in on government and government-linked entities. So not what the private sector could do, but what government could do. And we allowed ourselves to look across all time periods, short, medium, and long term. And the findings from this were really quite interesting. I mean, at a top level, initially, the need for the Arab region, you heard me quote the figure of 5 to 7 trillion globally and 2 to 4 trillion as a gap per year. In the Arab region, the gap is about $230 billion per year that needs to be mobilized every year to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There's a huge need for finance in this region. There's also a characteristic of the region which is different than most other places, and that's the degree to which the public sector spends. So there's a lot of government spending, 20% of spending on average in those 8 countries per year, reaching a high of 28% in Saudi Arabia, and that compares to only 17% globally on average. So this shows that there's a particular capability of the public sector to have an influence over the financial space. And the other thing we discovered when we were learning about financing a green transition in this space is that there's a lot of activity already happening. The report that we published, it shows about 35 different case studies that show that the region is already kind of making strides in this space, and there are kind of regional precedents for the solutions that we found. In order to really understand how to frame our recommendations and to really understand how to mobilize green finance, we broke the question down into two types of instruments, or two types of question. The first one, the enabling environment. So this is the conditions within which financial decisions are made. And the other was financial tools. So these are actual tools that can be used or implemented to mobilize private sector finance that are under the government's control. The enabling environment, I'll go through a few of the different areas. So the first one we looked at was awareness raising. Awareness really helps decision makers understand the rationale that underlies sustainability. So you're not just doing it because you're a nice guy, you're doing it because there's a rationale and an evidence base behind sustainable decision making. The region has a lot of vision statements, a lot of 2030, 2035, 2040 vision statements. And what's critical with the vision statement as an accompanying document is a financing strategy that really defines a project pipeline and links that with the most competitive financing options to show how these high-level ambitions and visions can be turned into real actions, and helps to ensure capital is deployed efficiently. The third thing we looked at was taxonomies. So taxonomies are basically a common language for investors, developers, or policymakers that explains what's green and what's not green. And this can really help bring clarity to investment options and help to avoid greenwashing in the green investment space. Taxonomies in turn support climate and nature-related disclosures. That's the disclosures in the next column. Disclosures really bring transparency to markets, and they expose risks to investors so that investors can make appropriate decisions based on climate or nature-related risks that are facing those organizations. We looked also at market facilitators. So these are entities like green investment banks or energy service company facilitators that overcome financial and non-financial barriers to markets. And the last thing in this enabling environment category was central banks. So central banks can use both their soft power as well as regulatory levers to encourage sustainable investments, which helps them really deliver on their core purpose, which is to safeguard financial stability. Okay, so we looked at these 6 different enabling conditions in our analysis. We also looked at a number of financial tools. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but I'll just show you them quite quickly. One is sovereign wealth funds as a tool of the government. Another is state-owned enterprises. The third is risks and risk insurance and guarantees. So these are things that can reduce the risk of investing, especially if there's high political risk or even technology risk for low carbon technologies. Carbon pricing can include both carbon taxes as well as carbon markets. And we looked at 4 more, so green bonds and sukuk, which are instruments to be able to raise capital for green projects. We looked at international climate finance. This is money coming from the United Nations or through the Global Environment Facility, for example. We looked penultimately at debt swaps. So debt swaps are an opportunity for governments to swap international debt for climate or nature-related activities and protections. And the last one is subsidies or inclusive loans. So these are ways to overcome financial barriers to otherwise high-value sustainable projects. Looking at these 14 different areas, we were able to assess the context of each of the countries and really understand which of these options and solutions best matched each country. We also interviewed about 20 or 30 experts from the region to get their views on which were most important. And this is kind of where we ended up. I'm not going to go through this in detail because of the time, but you can see that each country has a variety of different options, 2 to 4 options in each country. Almost all of them are a mix of financial tools and enabling environment conditions. But what I'm really going to focus on here are those 4 in the bottom, those regional opportunities, because we're talking about the Middle East region in this conference today. I'm going to go through these one by one and really just trying to explain what these recommendations mean and why they're important. Building awareness of sustainability's benefits, but also the risks of inaction, are really important, and they are kind of a critical first step to motivating change. There are a lot of entities in the region that are already doing this type of work. For example, the UN Regional Collaboration Center based in Dubai, or Egypt's Regional Center for Sustainable Finance. These are really critical to build awareness across sectors and audiences of both the upsides of low carbon transition and social justice, as well as the economic, social, and physical risks associated with inaction. We actually found that there's quite a strong awareness of the risks of transition, the risks of moving away from an oil and gas centered economy, but there's very little or much less understanding of the benefits of that kind of transition. So recognizing not only the benefits of where you're going, but also the risks of inaction, not just the risks of moving, of changing. This is a really critical step to underpin all action, and this applies to all countries. The next thing we looked at as a regional recommendation was this idea of a sustainable taxonomy. So it really gives some clear definitions for terms like sustainable, green, transition finance. They're all need to be clearly defined to identify activities and investments that deliver on these social and environmental objectives. So developing a regional taxonomy, not just a national one, but one that spans the countries in question, really brings clarity to the whole region and could underpin common standards, labels, disclosures. It could avoid greenwashing, really mitigate market fragmentation, and strengthen regional integration and the interoperability of the financial sector in the region. So, a regional taxonomy is something that could really, I think, mobilize a lot of money into these markets. There's examples already. So in the European Union, for example, they released their green taxonomy last year, and that's giving investors a lot of clarity as to where they're going to put their money to achieve some kind of green dividend. There's a couple of options already being discussed. For example, in Dubai and in Saudi Arabia, there are rather in Abu Dhabi and in Saudi Arabia, there are already moves to develop a green taxonomy, but making that as a regional effort rather than a national one, I think would deliver some dividends. The next one we're looking at is really the power of sovereign wealth funds. And this is actually something very, very substantial. So sovereign wealth funds in the region are the biggest in the world by far. Many are subscribed to the One Planet Sovereign Wealth Fund commitment, which ensures that sovereign wealth funds will invest in sustainability. This was launched by Emmanuel Macron a couple of years ago after the Paris Agreement. But when you do a real look into sovereign wealth funds in the region, they don't really perform very well in terms of their environmental, social, and governance ratings. All of them actually are below average, and I think 14 are in, or sorry, 6 or 7 are in the bottom 14 in terms of performance for ESG. So sovereign wealth funds have, I think, a big opportunity to improve the kind of environmental, social, and governance credentials. For example, none of them release an annual ESG report. So there's a lot of activity that can happen to. I'm sorry, I'm talking about sovereign wealth funds here. There's a lot of activity that can happen to improve sovereign wealth funds. The size of sovereign wealth funds is also enormous. So there's a huge volume of capital that can be redeployed to support the transition. We'll go back to this one, developing a regional carbon market. Really, carbon pricing is widely acknowledged to play a fundamental role in transitioning to a low carbon economy. And really, compared to other instruments like carbon taxes or feed-in tariffs or subsidies, market mechanisms like cap and trade can significantly reduce the overall cost of emissions reductions and can also be much more responsive to changes in economic conditions. So, there are a lot of pros and cons between carbon taxes and carbon markets. But I think, the political reality in the region is that carbon taxes aren't really on the table. So carbon markets are, I think, a much more effective way to reduce emissions in the region. And there's a strong interplay actually between carbon markets and the green taxonomy. If you're able to kind of harmonize definitions, harmonize assessment methodologies for emissions, then you're able to trade emission reduction credits across borders. And with a larger pool of credits, you're able to find more efficiencies. It also allows for example, a Gulf or MENA carbon market to potentially be linked to other large carbon markets like the European Emissions Trading Scheme, emerging markets in China, and also those in some US and states and Canadian provinces like the Western Climate Initiative. So there's a big opportunity for carbon markets to have an effect on emissions reductions in the region. I've discussed sovereign wealth funds already, and I want to just focus actually on one more thing that I think is really relevant to the region, and that's around state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises, SOEs, are hugely important globally. They emit about 20% of global emissions, and in the countries we studied, the figure is even higher. For example, in Qatar, just 4 state-owned enterprises, just 4 companies emit 27% of the country's total emissions. So not only are these huge emitters, but they're also giant companies that have deep pockets and an opportunity to invest in the transition. State-owned enterprises globally are also major providers of low-carbon alternatives. So SOEs can really invest in renewables. They're investing in hydrogen in a big way. So while they may be part of the problem, they're very much part of the solution as well, and need to be brought into the fold to affect this kind of low carbon transition. Something that makes SOEs a little bit different in this region is the fact that their governance isn't strictly separated from the state in MENA. So there's an opportunity for the governments to have a bit more influence over the decisions and choices that are made at state-owned enterprises to help those SOEs better align with national climate change targets. I think there's actually a real synergy also between state-owned enterprises and sovereign wealth funds. SOEs will continue to play a major role in the economies of these countries, and they, I think, can work together with sovereign wealth funds to access capital for transition finance and really move that type of transition finance into SOEs and help them move from today's higher carbon production to lower carbon alternatives in the future. This is my last slide, really, and I think why this matters for the GreenTECH conference, and why this is a good subject to start with. Why green finance is a good subject to start with. Really, green technology costs money. That's one of the basic ones, right? And it's really often money upfront. So green solutions often have, are better long-term investments. They have a better overall lifetime kind of cost, but they can suffer from high upfront capital costs. So overcoming those barriers, the high upfront capital costs, using different green finance options is really important to be able to build these types of interventions. For example, a wind farm and a solar farm, these have very high upfront capital costs, but very, very low running costs, right? There's no fuel involved in running them. Whereas a gas plant or a coal plant has, relatively small upfront costs, but you need to pay for fuel for the entire lifetime of that project. So you can see the difference there, why it may be more challenging to get a solar farm or wind farm built today. But once it's built, you're laughing for 25 years. With a gas plant or a coal plant, you're subject to the vagaries of the markets for fuel, and prices are not so assured in the long run. Overall, green technology costs money upfront, but is often a better bet in the long term. I think the options that I discussed today and the rest of the ones that are in this report I mentioned, they really apply to all sectors. So So the beauty of green finance is that it's not specific to any sector, it's sector agnostic. When you find a solution that works in one place, you can often apply it to other sectors as well. I think the fact that we found so many examples of these types of solutions already being used in the region, it really demonstrates the viability of these options in the region. So I think good practice can be learned across borders and shared across borders for sure. One issue that is a consistent complaint in some ways, or comment from the finance sector, is the fact that there's lots of money around, but there's just not enough bankable projects. Okay, that means that the projects that are defined don't have the right kind of financial returns and the right kind of financial profile to be considered investable by investors. These financial options and tools that I outlined are ways that can help to improve the bankability of projects and can really help to make them financially attractive, or at least break even from a risk reward perspective from the perspective of an investor. And that's really critical. I mean, we've got the technology, we've got lots of money around, and it's about kind of bridging that gap between the finance and the projects. How do you make those investable? How do you make those bankable and attractive to investors? And that's really what a lot of these mechanisms aim to do, is to improve the bankability of these projects. And finally, these options, I think, help to carve a transition pathway for countries that are dependent on oil and gas. So these projects are really about illustrating the potential for change, the potential for transformation in countries that may sometimes see themselves as especially challenged by the green transition. I think that the financing mechanisms we uncovered, linking that to some project pipeline and a clear financing strategy to achieve net zero goals, is really a viable pathway to transitioning from a carbon dependent economy to one that is viable in a future low carbon world. Overall, I really encourage you to read the report. It's called Financing a Green Transition in the Middle East. And I'm open for questions if possible. Otherwise, thank you very much. My name is Jeffrey Beyer, and the Managing Director of Zest Associates.